Capcom's Ace Attorney franchise is a series that I have a lot of fond memories with. I played the first entry during my first year of high school through the Ace Attorney trilogy on 3DS many moons ago, and ever since, these games have never failed to bring me joy. Everything from the lovable characters, the fantastic mysteries, the fun and exciting music, and all the wonderful sprite work continue to live rent-free in my head all these years later. So, today, I wanted to take a look back at each entry and see how their first trials fare. How well did they introduce the story in the world? Does the trial tie into later parts of the game? How does it compare to the other first cases? Let's find out, shall we? Also, as a disclaimer, I won't be discussing either of the investigation games as they don't exactly have trials. I'll also try to minimize spoilers as much as possible, and I won't discuss anything in the game past its first trial, but in some instances there will be minor spoilers, so be warned. Before I even began making this list, I already knew which trial was going to be dead last. I just never enjoyed this one. For the first trial, it was really long, which is fine. I don't think having a long first trial is always a bad thing, but in this case, it just really drags. And there are a lot of Ace Attorney cases that drag, like Rise from the Ashes is pretty slow, but the difference is that this trial drags on and has no real interesting payoff. The culprit is extremely obvious, and it's just not that interesting to get through. This trial is also supposed to serve as our introduction to the Kingdom of Khura'in, as well as the new mechanic that lets players see the victim's final moments. And it does an okay job at that. Overall, I've just never really enjoyed this one, and it's the only first trial in the series I'd say I actively disliked. As a whole, Dual Destinies definitely dropped the ball in some areas, but to the game's credit, I didn't really feel that in its first trial, as it's pretty alright. The case opens up with a courtroom exploding, which is definitely an exciting start, and immediately we're given a horde of unanswered questions. Why is Apollo bandaged up? Who is this Athena girl? And oh my goodness, is that Phoenix right? Anyways, like I said, the trial's pretty alright. It's got a really unique premise revolving around the bombing of a courtroom, in addition to a murder. It's pretty high concept for a first trial, and I think it does a decent job at hooking players back into the world of Ace Attorney, following Apollo Justice's first story. This is also our first introduction to Athena Sykes and her mood matrix mechanic. It's a cool mechanic, and Athena is a good character, but her introduction does feel a little rushed here, especially since it feels like Apollo's story was just beginning. Also, for as high concept as the trial is, it doesn't feel nearly as exciting as some of the other first trials in the series, which is why I've placed it lower on the list. A good trial overall though, just not an amazing or fantastic one. The first ever Ace Attorney trial. This trial is iconic, and for good reason. In my opinion, it does a stellar job at introducing the world to how an Ace Attorney game plays. The killer is revealed right before the trial even starts, a clever move on the developer's end, as it removes some tension off players and makes catching the killer a bit easier. I've always loved the joke at the beginning of the trial too. See, when the judge asks Phoenix to name the victim in this case, one of the dialogue options is a cinder block. It's stupid, but it always brings a smile to my face. Larry, the comedic relief character, being the accused, also makes a pretty good fit, as his melodramatic antics add a lot to the light comedy of the first case, something that's actually pretty common throughout the entire game. The trial isn't deep or complicated, and it shouldn't have to be. It's fun, simple, and a really nice way to ease players into the franchise. Overall, a good first trial. So, from the discourse I've observed online, a lot of people don't seem to like this trial, and while I see why others think that way, I don't know, man, I've always thought this was a fun one. In the Lost Turnabout, Phoenix has been bonked on the head, giving him temporary amnesia, and now has to stand in court as he stumbles around trying to remember what's going on. It's admittedly a pretty stupid setup, but it works well enough for a sequel, as returning players are given a reason as to why Phoenix needs things explained to him, and new players are just as confused as Phoenix. I know nowadays, Justice for All is nobody's first Ace Attorney game, as it's packaged in the Trilogy collection as the second game in the series. But interestingly enough, I've actually seen a lot of people online claim that Justice for All was actually their first entry into the series. The criminal is once again revealed at the beginning of the case, opting for a similar effect seen in the first game's first trial. I've always liked how lighthearted this trial was, as a lot of the solutions are pretty silly. I also like the killer here way more than I do in the first game's first trial. He's a lot more cartoonishly villainous, and I adore his strange design. Also, I enjoy Maggie Bride's character far more than I did Larry. Sorry, Larry. Overall, this is a perfectly fun trial in my eyes, and it's a good way to hook players back into the world of Ace Attorney following the first game. The Adventure of the Great Departure is a unique case, as it serves as the introduction to an entirely new world, new characters, and a new setting, something that no other case since the first Ace Attorney game has had to do. On that end, the case succeeds quite well in my opinion. This is our first time meeting Ryunosuke Naruhodo, an ancestor of Phoenix Wright, and the unlucky student accused of murder. By his side is his best friend, Kazuma Asogi, who will help defend Ryunosuke in court. There's a lot at stake here, as not only is Ryunosuke himself on trial, but if he fails to defend himself, his best friend will lose his study trip to London, which means he'll never become a lawyer. This keeps tensions high and makes for a very exciting start to a game that only gets, well, more exciting. Plus, the trial has a really great red herring, something not often seen in first cases. In contrast to the first Ace Attorney's killer, for instance, the killer in this case is way more slippery, and it takes a lot more effort to catch them. Not to mention, this case had a lot of witnesses that add so much charm and personality to the world, which I thought was something really important to do, since this is our first time experiencing this new world. Sure, this wasn't the craziest first case, and there were a few areas to improve for sure. For one, the pacing could have been a bit better. For the first case, it did drag quite a bit, being split into 3 whole parts. But in my eyes, it still served as a great introduction to the brilliant, great Ace Attorney duology. Okay, I'll fully admit it, I'm rather biased in regards to this trial. Susato Mikotoba was one of the best parts of the first Great Ace Attorney game for me, as she quickly became one of my favorite characters in the entire franchise, so being able to play as her in court was a joyous shock to see. The case opens up by giving us a monologue of Susato as she reminisces about her time in London before revealing that she will be standing in court as a lawyer. Now, since this game was set in Japan during the Meiji era, women weren't allowed to stand in court, so their solution was to dress Susato up and give her a false identity, that of Ryutaro Naruhodo, the cousin of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. This is an incredibly clever way to allow players to play as Susato, and it also does so without making her a permanent lawyer. In this trial, Susato must defend her best friend, Rei, who's being accused of murder. Now, on the merit of being able to play as Susato alone, this case would be pretty high up, but there's even more to it. This case ties its murder back into the first game's first trial, and also answers some mysteries from that first game, while also setting up new ones. The pacing is also greatly improved from the first game's first trial, only being 2 parts this time. As a whole, this trial is just super fun to go through, and the killer makes for a good first villain. In my eyes, this was an absolutely brilliant way to open up Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve, and this trial remains one of the series' best introductions in my eyes. It seems that for many Ace Attorney fans, Trials and Tribulations is the peak of the franchise. Even those who wouldn't necessarily put it at number 1, like myself, it's impossible to deny this game's quality. This fan-favorite status held by the third Ace Attorney game becomes extremely apparent when playing its first case, Turnabout Memories. Immediately, players are hit with one of the biggest shocks in the entire franchise, being able to play as Mia Fey. Being able to play as Phoenix's mentor that guided him for 2 entire games will never not be cool. Playing as other characters besides the protagonist is something that happens a lot more in the later games, but Trials and Tribulations set that precedent. As for the case itself, it's incredibly intriguing, as our client is actually Phoenix Wright, a much younger Phoenix Wright, that is. This trial is also our first time seeing Dahlia Hawthorne, a critically important character to the overall story for the third game. It sets up the rest of the game really well, while also providing both a backstory for Phoenix and Mia's characters. Comparing Turnabout Memories to the first trials from the first two Ace Attorney games is like day and night. The jump in narrative quality is immense, as the previous two games were more lighthearted and isolated in terms of their first cases, while Turnabout Memories tries to play into the game's greater narrative. This is the trial that's kinda difficult to discuss without spoiling things, but I'm sure many fans would agree, this is one of Ace Attorney's best trials. Now this is how you open an Ace Attorney game. For my money, Turnabout Trump is not only the best opening trial this series has ever seen, but also one of the best cases overall. This case serves as our first introduction to Apollo Justice, a new defense attorney, and it immediately hooks players in with its setup. Firstly, our client is Phoenix Wright, defense attorney of legend, now a poker player dubbed Hobo Phoenix by fans. Now, 7 years have passed since the original trilogy's conclusion, which immediately makes players wonder what's happened since then, as our beloved lawyer is now a seemingly completely different person. As a whole, Apollo Justice is a game that exudes a fantastic sense of mystery, and that's extremely evident in the game's first case. I don't want to dive too much into the details, as it's actually very clever and well thought out, so if you haven't played Apollo Justice yet, I wouldn't want to spoil the experience, but it really is a fantastic trial. It also ties really well into the later parts of the game, and especially the game's final case. This first trial acts as a catalyst for not only the events of the rest of the Apollo Justice game, but both Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice. Like I said, it's kinda hard to talk about what makes this trial so great without, spoiling the entire trial, so just take my word for it. Or don't.